Widow buys old house to retire, but what she finds there changes her life forever. Margaret Wilson was breaking down in silent tears as she carried her only suitcase along the dirt road. The forced retirement at 68, after losing Richard, her husband of 45 years, had left her life directionless and her resources limited. It was then that she spotted the window of the small wooden house she had bought online and saw a thin little face peeking from behind the dusty glass. Margaret stopped in her tracks, blinking several times to make sure she wasn't seeing things. The face quickly disappeared, but she was sure of what she had seen. A child was inside the house that was supposed to have been empty for years. "Is someone there?" shouted Margaret, slowly approaching the main door. The silence that followed made her heart race. The real estate agent had assured her that the property had been unoccupied since the previous owner had left, leaving everything behind. Margaret searched for the keys in her pocket with trembling hands, still trying to process what she had just seen. When she finally managed to open the creaky door, the smell of mold and dust hit her like a wave. The house was clearly abandoned, with furniture covered by sheets and spiderwebs decorating every corner. But Margaret could feel that she wasn't alone there. "Hello? I'm the new owner," she called, leaving the suitcase on the floor and walking slowly through the living room. A muffled noise came from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. Margaret looked at the wooden staircase that creaked under the weight of the years and gathered the courage to climb it. Each step groaned under her feet, echoing through the silent house. At the top of the stairs, 3 doors opened to small bedrooms. Margaret checked the first one, then the second, both empty, except for the accumulation of dust and some old furniture. But when she approached the third room, she heard a panting breath. "I know someone is here," said Margaret, with a voice firmer than she felt. "I won't hurt you. I just want to talk." The door was ajar. Margaret pushed it slowly and saw a small figure crouched behind an old bed. It was a boy, probably about 10 or 11 years old, too thin, with dirty and torn clothes. His large dark eyes were full of fear. "Please don't send me away," whispered the boy, his voice hoarse. "I have nowhere to go." Margaret felt her chest tighten. The boy was trembling, clearly terrified, and she could see that he was malnourished. His clothes were several sizes too big for his scrawny body, as if they belonged to someone much older. "What's your name?" asked Margaret, slowly crouching down to be at the boy's level. "Matthew," he replied, without taking his eyes off the floor. "Matthew Brown." "And what are you doing here, Matthew?" The boy lifted his eyes, revealing a deep sadness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Margaret felt tears welling up in her own eyes as she saw that lost expression. "My grandma lived here," said Matthew, his voice almost inaudible. She left and forgot me." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Margaret sat on the dusty floor trying to process the boy's words. The real estate agent had mentioned that the house belonged to an elderly lady who had suddenly disappeared, leaving everything behind. But she hadn't mentioned anything about a child. "How long have you been here alone, Mass?" asked Margaret, keeping her voice calm despite the shock. "I'm not sure," murmured Matthew, wiping his nose on his torn sleeve. "Maybe 2 months? 3? The days blend together." Margaret's heart broke. 2 or 3 weeks would already be too long for a child to be alone, but months, how had he survived? And where were the adults responsible for him? "Matthew, where are your parents?" she asked gently. The boy shook his head, more tears streaming down his dirty face. "My mum, she's not here anymore, and I never knew my dad. I only had my grandma Dorothy." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She knew well the pain of losing someone important, the feeling of being completely alone in the world. But she was an adult with resources and experience. Matthew was just a child. "And your grandmother just left?" Margaret insisted, trying to understand the situation. "She was very tired," explained Matthew, his voice taking on a dreamy tone as if remembering. "Said she needed to rest. Told me I was a smart boy and that I'd be fine alone for a few days." But she didn't come back. Margaret stood up slowly, extending her hand to Matthew. "Let's go downstairs and you can tell me more about what happened, okay? And I think you're hungry." Matthew hesitated for a moment before accepting Margaret's hand. His fingers were thin and cold, like winter branches. When he stood up, Margaret could see he was even thinner than she had imagined. His clothes, which had probably belonged to his grandmother, hung on his frail body like a sack. In the kitchen, Margaret found some old provisions in the cabinets. Nothing fresh, but there were canned goods and some packages of cookies that were still within their expiration date. She prepared a simple snack while Matthew sat at the table, watching every movement intently. "Matthew, tell me how you've been managing to eat all these days," said Margaret, placing a plate in front of him. The boy lowered his eyes, clearly ashamed. "There's a neighbour's garden out back. I take some things when it's really dark. And there are fruits on the trees." "You've been stealing food?" asked Margaret, no judgment in her voice. "I know it's wrong," whispered Matthew, tears starting to flow again. "But I was so hungry, really hungry. Some days my stomach hurt so much I couldn't even sleep." Margaret felt a wave of compassion wash over her chest. She knew hunger herself, not physical, but emotional. That feeling of emptiness that seemed never to be filled after losing Richard. But seeing a child going through basic needs was completely different. "You didn't do anything wrong, Matthew," she said, sitting beside him. "You're just a child trying to survive. Anyone would do the same." Matthew ate slowly, as if wanting to savor every bite. Margaret watched silently, mentally planning what to do next. She couldn't just leave the boy there alone, but she also had no idea what the legal procedures were for a situation like this. "Matthew, do you remember your grandmother's full name?" Margaret asked when he finished eating. "Dorothy Brown," he replied promptly. "Dorothy Marie Brown. She always made sure I knew her full name." Margaret made a mental note. At least she had something to start an investigation. Maybe she could find out what had happened to the woman and if she had other relatives who could take care of Matthew. "And do you remember any other relatives, uncles, cousins, anyone from the family?" Matthew's face closed off instantly. Grandma always said it was better not to talk about them, that they weren't good people. This response intrigued Margaret. Why would a grandmother discourage her grandson from contacting family? Unless there was some serious reason for it. "Okay, we don't need to talk about that now," said Margaret, noticing the boy's discomfort. "How about you show me where you've been sleeping all these days?" Matthew led her back upstairs, but this time to a different room, the one that had clearly been his grandmother's. The bed was unmade, and Margaret could see that the boy had created a sort of nest there, using old blankets and some clothes. "I sleep here because it still smells like her," explained Matthew, hugging a faded pillow. "Sometimes I pretend she's just in the bathroom and will be right back." Margaret's heart tightened again. She knew that feeling well. How many times had she caught herself waiting to hear Richard's key in the door, or thinking she heard him calling her name from the living room? "Matthew, listen," said Margaret, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You can't stay here alone. I need to contact the authorities to—" "No!" shouted Matthew, pulling away from her with eyes wide with terror. "Please, don't turn me over to them. They'll put me in a bad place. I know they will." "Matthew, calm down," Margaret tried, extending her hands in a reassuring gesture. "No one is going to put you in any bad place. There are people who take care of children who—" "You don't understand," interrupted Matthew, now crying openly. "Grandma always said that if anything happened to her, I should never let them take me. She said they only wanted the house. They didn't really want to take care of me." Margaret stopped talking, processing the boy's words. It seemed there was much more to this story than she had initially imagined. If Matthew's grandmother had left specific instructions for him to hide from the authorities, there must have been a very serious reason. "Who are they, Matthew?" asked Margaret carefully. "The relatives," murmured the boy. "Grandma said they showed up when I was little, wanting to take me, but she never let them. She said they only wanted the inheritance." Now things were starting to make sense. Margaret had heard stories like that before. Families who appeared when there was property or money involved, pretending to care about orphaned children when they really only wanted the assets. "Matthew, Where did your grandmother keep the important papers? Documents, certificates, things like that. The boy thought for a moment before pointing to an old dresser in the corner of the room. She always went through that drawer when she was worried. She said they were important papers. Margaret walked over to the dresser and tried to open the drawer. It was locked, but a quick search found a small key hidden under a picture frame. Inside the drawer, she found a metal box with several documents. Matthew's birth certificate, his mother's birth certificate, who apparently had died when he was just 4 years old, house documents, and some letters. Margaret picked up one of the letters and began to read. It was from a law office, dated 6 months ago. It talked about a custody dispute involving Matthew, and mentioned that some distant relatives were questioning Dorothy's ability to care for the child, citing her advanced age. "Matthew," called Margaret, coming back near him with the letter in her hand. "Your grandmother was having legal problems with your relatives, wasn't she?" The boy nodded sadly. "She would get very nervous when letters came. She said people wanted to take me from her, but that she would never let them." Margaret continued reading the documents. The situation was more complicated than she had imagined. Apparently some distant cousins of Dorothy had filed a lawsuit claiming that she was not fit to care for Matthew due to her age. They offered to adopt the boy. But there was something strange in the documents. They mentioned that Dorothy's house was worth significantly more than what Margaret had paid for it. In fact, according to the papers, the property was worth almost 10 times more than she had paid. "How is this possible?" murmured Margaret to herself. "What is it?" asked Matthew, coming closer. "Matthew, do you know if your grandmother sold this house to anyone before she passed away?" The boy shook his head. "She always said this house was ours, that no one would ever take it from us." "Why?" Margaret was confused. How had she managed to buy the house for so little if it was worth much more? And if Dorothy hadn't sold the property, how had the real estate agent been able to offer it for sale? She picked up the phone to call the agent, but soon realized there was no signal there. The house really was in a very isolated area, about 15 kilometers from the nearest town. "Matthew, has your house always been like this, without a phone and without internet?" asked Margaret. "Grandma said it was better this way," replied the boy, "that bad people couldn't find us if we weren't connected to the world." That answer made Margaret think. Dorothy had purposely isolated herself and her grandson, probably to protect him from the relatives who wanted custody, but that also meant that when something had happened to her, no one knew that Matthew was there alone. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange hues that came through the house's windows. Margaret realized she needed to make some quick decisions. She couldn't leave Matthew alone for another night, but she also couldn't just take him away without understanding the legal situation better. "Matthew, I'm going to stay here tonight," announced Margaret. "Tomorrow we'll go to the city together and try to find out what happened to your grandmother, okay?" The boy's face lit up for the first time since she had found him. "You're really going to stay?" "Yes, I am," confirmed Margaret, surprising herself with her own decision. "But first, I need to find a place to sleep. Can you help me find clean sheets?" Matthew jumped off the bed with more energy than he had shown until then. Of course, Grandma always kept bedding in the hallway closet. While they prepared a room for Margaret, she observed how Matthew seemed revitalized just by having company. The boy talked more, smiled occasionally, and even seemed less thin now that he had eaten something nutritious. After making the bed, Margaret and Matthew prepared a simple supper with what they found in the pantry. While they ate, Margaret asked more questions about Matthew's life with his grandmother. "Did she homeschool you? Do you know how to read and write?" "Yes, I do," Matthew replied proudly. "Grandma was a teacher before she retired. She taught me everything: math, English, history. She was even teaching me Spanish." That explained why Matthew spoke so well for a child who had been isolated for so long. Dorothy had clearly dedicated herself to her grandson's education. "And you never left here? Not even to go shopping or to the doctor?" "Sometimes we went to the city," said Matthew, playing with his food, "but always very early in the morning when there were few people on the street, and Grandma always wore sunglasses and a scarf on her head. She said it was to not draw attention." Margaret was beginning to understand the level of paranoia Dorothy had developed to protect her grandson. The woman had clearly taken extreme measures to keep Matthew away from the relatives who wanted custody of him. "Matthew, do you remember the last conversation you had with your grandmother?" What did she say before she passed? The boy's face saddened again. She was very tired that day, more than usual. She stayed in bed almost the whole time, sometimes calling me just to give me a hug. And what did she say? She said she loved me very much, that I was the most important thing in her life, murmured Matthew, tears beginning to form in his eyes. She said that if something happened to her, I should hide until I found someone I could trust, someone with a good heart. Margaret felt a chill. Dorothy's words sounded like a farewell, as if she knew something was about to happen. Did she say anything else? She said she left some things hidden for me, continued Matthew. That when I grew up, I would understand everything, and that I should never believe people who said bad things about her. What kind of things did she hide? I don't know, admitted the boy. She said I would know when the time was right. Margaret decided not to press further for now. Matthew had already been through enough trauma, and she didn't want to force him to recall painful details. After dinner, while Matthew took a bath for the first time in weeks, Margaret examined more documents from the box. She found several letters from an attorney warning Dorothy about the lawsuit filed by the relatives, and some handwritten notes by Dorothy herself. One of the notes caught her attention. They don't know about the will. M is protected, but I need to make sure he finds the instructions when it's necessary. What will? And what instructions? Margaret searched through the rest of the papers, but found no will or similar document. When Matthew came out of the bathroom looking much cleaner and healthier, Margaret was determined to uncover the truth about what had happened to Dorothy. Matthew, I'm going to ask you a very important question, said Margaret, sitting beside him on the living room couch. Are you sure your grandmother left? Did you see her leave the house? The boy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I think so. Actually, I'm not sure. I was sleeping, and when I woke up, she wasn't here anymore. And didn't you think it was strange for her to leave without waking you to say goodbye? I did, admitted Matthew, his voice growing small. Grandma never did anything without telling me first, but I found a note from her in the kitchen saying she had gone to take care of some important things and would be back soon. Do you still have that note? Matthew ran to the kitchen and returned with a yellowed piece of paper. Margaret examined it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, very different from the firm script she had seen in Dorothy's other documents. Matthew, are you sure your grandmother wrote this? Asked Margaret gently. The boy looked at the paper more closely. Now that you mention it, the writing is a bit different, but I thought it was because she was tired. Margaret was beginning to suspect that something very serious had happened to Dorothy. The combination of her advanced age, the legal pressure from the relatives, and the fact that she had left Matthew alone without a clear plan to return. All of it pointed to a possibility she didn't want to consider. Matthew, let's get ready for bed, said Margaret, deciding it would be better to investigate further in the morning. Tomorrow we'll go to the city and try to find out what really happened. But before she could fall asleep, Margaret heard Matthew crying softly in the next room. She got up and went to him, finding the boy hugging his grandmother's pillow, sobbing. Matthew, she called gently. I miss her so much, cried Matthew, and I'm afraid she'll never come back. I'm afraid I'll never see her again. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and, without a second thought, hugged the boy. I know what it's like to lose someone important, she whispered. It's like a part of us goes with them. That's exactly how it feels, agreed Matthew, nestling into the hug. It's like there's a hole in my chest. But do you know what I've learned? Said Margaret, stroking the boy's hair. That even when the people we love are no longer physically with us, the love they felt for us stays right here inside, and no one can take that away. Matthew stopped crying and looked at her with curious eyes. Did you lose someone important too? Yes, I did, confirmed Margaret. My husband. He passed away 6 months ago. And do you still feel that hole in your chest? I do, admitted Margaret. But now I also feel something new, a desire to take care of you, to help you. I think that's how love works. It transforms into other good things. Matthew snuggled closer into Margaret's embrace. Will you leave me too? I won't leave you, promised Margaret, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "We'll find out together what happened to your grandmother, and then we'll see how we can work everything out in the best way for you." "Even if it's hard?" "Even if it's hard," confirmed Margaret. For the first time in months, both Margaret and Matthew slept through the entire night, finding comfort in each other's presence. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, Margaret woke up early and found Matthew already up, tidying the kitchen. The boy had prepared a simple coffee and found some fruit in the pantry. "Good morning," said Margaret, impressed with the boy's independence. "Good morning," replied Matthew, offering a cup of coffee. "I always wake up early. Grandma used to say mornings are the best times of the day." After breakfast, Margaret and Matthew got ready to go into town. Margaret had decided their first stop would be the county clerk's office to try and find out information about the legal status of the property. Then, they would go to the police station to report Dorothy's disappearance. The walk to town took about 20 minutes. Matthew knew the trail well, showing Margaret shortcuts and landmarks that he and his grandmother used to use. "Over there is where we used to pick jabuticaba." Matthew pointed to a tree laden with fruit. "And over there is where Grandma taught me how to recognize medicinal plants." Margaret could see that, despite the isolation, Matthew's life with his grandmother had been rich with learning and affection. This made the mystery of Dorothy's disappearance even more disturbing. In town, the first person they sought out was the county clerk. Mr. Walter was an elderly man who knew practically everyone in the area. "Dorothy Brown," he repeated when Margaret mentioned the name. "Of course I know her. Hard-working woman raised her grandson alone, but it's been a while since I've seen her around here." "Mr. Walter, I bought her house through a real estate agency," explained Margaret. "But I found some documents that suggest the sale might not have been legal." The clerk raised his eyebrows. "Which agency?" Margaret showed him the purchase papers. Mr. Walter examined them carefully, shaking his head. "That agency doesn't exist anymore," he said. "It closed 3 months ago due to irregular practices. And look, this signature here doesn't look like Dorothy's." Margaret's heart sank. "Are you saying the sale was fake?" "I'm saying there's something very wrong here," confirmed Mr. Walter. "Dorothy would never sell that house. It was the only place in the world where she felt safe with the boy." Margaret looked at Matthew, who was standing beside her, listening intently. "And you haven't heard from her? No one knows where she is?" "No one at all," said Mr. Walter, scratching his beard. "And that's strange, because she used to come here regularly to take care of legal matters, always very concerned about her grandson's future." "What kind of legal matters?" "She was fighting some relatives who wanted custody of the boy," explained the clerk. "Some second cousins who appeared out of nowhere when they found out she had a valuable property." "Valuable how?" Mr. Walter lowered his voice. "Dorothy's house sits right on top of a mineral water spring. They discovered that about 2 years ago. The property is worth a fortune now." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Margaret's mind. The relatives didn't just want to take care of Matthew. They wanted the valuable property that would come with the child's custody. "These relatives, do you know their names?" "Of course. Nathan and Martha Thompson," said Mr. Walter. "Brother and sister-in-law of Dorothy's deceased cousin. They had never shown interest in the boy before the mineral water discovery." Margaret mentally noted the names. "And are they still in town?" "Yes, they are. In fact, they were around here asking about Dorothy last week. They said she had disappeared and that they wanted to locate the grandson." Margaret felt a chill. If Nathan and Martha were looking for Matthew, it was crucial to keep him safe until they understood the situation better. "Mr. Walter, I need to ask you a favor," said Margaret. "Could you not mention to anyone that I was here with Matthew, at least until we clarify what happened to Dorothy?" The notary nodded gravely. "Don't worry, my dear. I've always had my suspicions about those Thompsons. They showed up here with an expensive attorney making demands, but they never showed real concern for the boy's well-being." Leaving the notary's office, Margaret decided it would be better not to go to the police station yet. If Dorothy's relatives were actively searching for Matthew, reporting the situation officially could place him directly in their hands. "Matthew, we need to go back home and think carefully about what to do," said Margaret as they walked through the small town streets. "Are you still going to help me?" asked Matthew, uncertain. "Of course I will," confirmed Margaret, "but we need to be smart. There are people who want to find you, and we don't know if they have good intentions." On the way back, Margaret bought basic supplies, food, cleaning products, and some medicine. She had decided they would stay in the house until they found out what had really happened to Dorothy. When they arrived home, Margaret and Matthew found the front door ajar. Margaret was sure she had locked it before leaving. "Matthew, stay behind me," whispered Margaret, carefully approaching the house. Inside, it was clear that someone had ransacked the house. Drawers open, papers scattered, furniture overturned. Whoever had been there was looking for something specific. "My God," murmured Margaret, looking at the mess. Matthew ran to his grandmother's room and shouted, "The box! The document box is gone!" Margaret rushed upstairs and confirmed it. The metal box with all of Dorothy's important papers had disappeared. Whoever had broken into the house knew exactly what they were looking for. "Matthew, did you hide anything that your grandmother gave you? Any paper or document?" The boy thought for a moment. "There's something she gave me and told me never to show anyone, but I don't know if I should—" "Matthew, your grandmother entrusted this to you," said Margaret firmly, "and now you need to trust me. Bad people were here and took important documents. We need to know what your grandmother wanted you to know." Matthew hesitated for another moment before running to the backyard. Margaret followed him and saw the boy digging behind a tree, pulling out a small can wrapped in plastic. Inside the can was a key, a folded paper, and an old photo. Margaret immediately recognized the photo. It was of herself as a child, next to a girl the same age. "Matthew, where did your grandmother get this photo?" asked Margaret, her voice trembling. "She always said you were the daughter she never had," replied Matthew, looking confused. "She said you were best friends in childhood, but a silly fight separated you." Margaret felt her legs go weak. Dorothy, her best childhood friend, lost for over 50 years after an argument over a boy they both liked. Margaret had tried to find her several times over the years, but Dorothy had moved away and they lost contact. "Matthew," said Margaret with tears in her eyes, "your grandmother was my best friend when we were children. We lost touch a long time ago." "I know," Matthew said simply. "She always said that if anything happened to her you would show up, that you had a good heart and would take care of me." Margaret was shocked. "But how did she know I would come? How did she know I would buy the house?" Matthew unfolded the paper from the can. It was a handwritten letter by Dorothy, addressed to Margaret. "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this letter, it means my plan worked. Yes, it was all planned. When I found out that my greedy relatives were trying to take Matthew away from me, I started thinking about how to protect him. I remembered you, our childhood friendship, how you were always fair and caring. I researched your life and found out you had recently been widowed. I knew you would need a fresh start, just as Matthew would need someone who truly cared for him. Through contacts, I managed to have the house offered to you at a low price. It was my way of making sure you would come here. I knew that when you found Matthew, your heart wouldn't let you abandon him. Forgive me for leaving without saying a proper goodbye to both of you. My tired heart couldn't take the fight anymore, but I wanted to make sure Matthew stayed with someone trustworthy. The key in this can opens a safe deposit box at the bank. There you will find my real will, leaving everything to Matthew and documents proving the illegal attempts by the relatives to gain custody of him. Take care of my boy, Margaret, and forgive an old friend for this last mischief." With eternal love, Dorothy Margaret finished reading the letter with tears streaming down her face. Dorothy had orchestrated everything, the sale of the house, the meeting with Matthew, all to ensure her grandson stayed protected. "She planned it all," whispered Margaret, hugging Matthew. "Your grandmother brought me to you on purpose." "So you won't abandon me?" asked Matthew, his voice full of hope. "Never," promised Margaret. "Your grandmother entrusted me with the most precious boy in the world. I will never abandon you." But before they could fully process the revelation, they heard the sound of cars approaching. Through the window, Margaret saw 2 cars parking in front of the house. "Matthew, let's go," Margaret said urgently. "We need to get out of here now." They left through the back of the house, carrying only the can with the important documents. Margaret guided Matthew along the trail he had shown her earlier, toward the woods. Behind them, they could hear voices calling, "Matthew, we're your uncles, we've come to get you." "They're not my uncles," Matthew whispered to Margaret as they ran. "Grandma always said my only real relatives were the people who loved me." Margaret and Matthew spent the night hidden in the woods, planning their next move. With the safe deposit key and Dorothy's letter, they had evidence to prove the false relatives' true intentions. "Tomorrow, we'll go to another city," Margaret decided. "We'll see a lawyer and take care of all the legal paperwork. Then we'll come back and face these people the right way." "And after that?" asked Matthew. "After that, we'll go home," said Margaret, smiling for the first time in months. "We'll take care of your grandmother's house and start our new life together." The next morning, Margaret and Matthew began a journey that would change their lives forever. With the documents Dorothy had left, they managed to prove that Nathan and Martha Thompson had no legal rights over Matthew, and that their attempts to gain custody were based on financial interests. The true will of Dorothy made it clear that she named Margaret as Matthew's guardian should anything happen to her. The document had been registered months before her passing, proving it was her genuine wish. When they finally returned home, it was to find a true home, a place where a lonely widow and an orphaned boy had found a family in each other, just as Dorothy had planned. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 3 months had passed since Margaret had found Matthew in that dusty house. Now the property had transformed into a real home. The windows were always open, letting in light and fresh air. The garden, which Dorothy had tended with such care, had bloomed again under Matthew's attentive watch. Margaret had officially adopted Matthew through a legal process that went smoothly, especially after the evidence about Nathan and Martha's true motives came to light. The couple had given up fighting for custody when it became clear they wouldn't gain access to the valuable property. "Margaret, look what grew in the garden," shouted Matthew from the backyard, running toward the house with a basket full of ripe tomatoes. Margaret smiled at the boy's energy. In the past months, Matthew had gained enough weight to look healthy. His face had color, and more importantly, his eyes had regained their sparkle of curiosity and joy. "How beautiful, my dear," said Margaret, affectionately using the term that had become natural between them. "Shall we make tomato sauce for lunch?" "Can I help cook?" asked Matthew, as he always did. He had developed the habit of wanting to join in all household activities, as if wanting to make sure he was useful and wanted. "Of course you can. In fact, today is a special day," said Margaret with a mysterious smile. "Why?" asked Matthew, curious. "Because today marks exactly 3 months since we met, and I have a surprise for you." Margaret went to her room and came back carrying a wrapped box. Matthew opened it carefully, revealing an empty photo album and a simple digital camera. "It's for us to start our own collection of memories," explained Margaret. "Dorothy left many photos of the two of you, but now we want to create our own memories together." Matthew's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. "Can I take a picture of us now?" "Yes, you can," said Margaret, hugging the boy. Matthew set the camera's timer and ran to stand beside Margaret. When the flash went off, it captured 2 genuine smiles, a woman who had found purpose again and a boy who had found security and love. But life is rarely simple, and Margaret would soon discover that there were still challenges ahead. That afternoon, while Matthew was studying on the porch, Margaret had made sure he continued his formal education through distance learning. She received an unexpected visitor. An elegant woman in her 50s parked in front of the house. She wore expensive clothes and drove a new car. Margaret watched from the window as the visitor approached the door. "Good afternoon," the woman said when Margaret answered. "My name is Sylvia Rodriguez. I'm a state social worker. I need to speak with you about Matthew Brown." Margaret's heart raced. "What about Matthew?" "May I come in?" asked Sylvia, showing her identification. Margaret led her to the living room, asking Matthew to continue studying on the porch. She didn't want the boy to overhear a conversation that might make him anxious. "Mrs. Margaret, "We received an anonymous complaint alleging that Matthew's adoption was irregular," began Sylvia, opening a folder. "The person who made the claim says you took advantage of the child's vulnerable situation." "That's ridiculous," replied Margaret, trying to stay calm. "All the documents were verified by lawyers. The adoption was completely legal." "I know that," said Sylvia, her expression softening a bit. "Actually, I came here more to see the situation in person than to investigate irregularities. The documents really are in order, but I need to assess if the environment is suitable for Matthew." Margaret breathed a little easier, but was still tense. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "How has his adjustment been?" asked Sylvia, looking around the clean and organized house. "Matthew is an incredible child," said Margaret sincerely. "Smart, affectionate, responsible. He went through a terrible trauma being alone for so long, but he's recovering well." "And you? How have you handled the responsibility of raising a child at 68? This question touched on an insecurity that Margaret carried. "I admit that sometimes I worry if I'm young enough to give Matthew everything he needs. But I have energy, health, and most importantly, I have love to give." Sylvia made some notes. "May I speak with Matthew?" "Of course," agreed Margaret, calling the boy. Matthew entered the room a bit nervous but polite. Sylvia talked with him for about 15 minutes, asking questions about his routine, his feelings, and his plans for the future. "Matthew, are you happy here with Margaret?" asked Sylvia directly. "Very happy," replied Matthew without hesitation. "Margaret takes care of me, teaches me new things, and makes me feel safe. It's like Grandma sent her to look after me." "And do you miss children your own age? Would you like to go to school?" Matthew thought for a moment. "Sometimes I miss having friends my age, but Margaret said when I feel ready, I can go to the city school. For now, I like studying at home with her." Sylvia smiled. "Thank you, Matthew. You can go back to your studies." When they were alone again, Sylvia addressed Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret, I'll be direct with you. Matthew's adjustment is exemplary. He's a well-adjusted, polite, and clearly loved child. I see no problem with the current situation." Margaret sighed in relief. "Thank you." "But," Sylvia continued, "I have some recommendations. Matthew needs contact with other children. I suggest you consider enrolling him in some extracurricular activity in the city, or at least in a socialization group." "I was already thinking about that," admitted Margaret. "Maybe soccer lessons or some art class? Excellent. And one last thing." Sylvia hesitated. "The complaint we received, I'm almost certain it came from the relatives who tried to get custody of Matthew. They might try other legal tactics. You need to be prepared." Margaret felt a chill. "What kind of tactics?" "They could claim that a person your age isn't capable of caring for a child long-term, or they might question financial matters. My advice is to document everything: Matthew's routine, his academic progress, his physical and emotional health. If you need to defend yourself legally, you'll have solid evidence." After Sylvia left, Margaret talked honestly with Matthew about the visit. She had learned that transparency was important to maintain trust between them. "Matthew, do you understand that some people might question our family?" asked Margaret. "I understand," said Matthew, mature beyond his years. "But they don't know how we take care of each other, right? They don't know that you help me with nightmares and I help you in the garden." "Exactly," agreed Margaret. "But we need to show the world that we're a real family. How about we start participating more in town life?" That's how Margaret and Matthew began attending the local church on Sundays, not out of religious obligation, but to connect with the community. Matthew enrolled in a swimming class in town, where he quickly made friends. Mrs. Irene, the swimming instructor, became an unexpected ally. She had known Dorothy and was moved to learn that Matthew was well cared for. Dorothy always worried about the boy's future, Mrs. Irene told Margaret after one of the classes. She would be very happy to know he found a family that truly loves him. "Did you know Dorothy well?" asked Margaret. "Yes, I did. She came here to town sometimes, always very reserved. But once she told me about you," revealed Mrs. Irene. "About me?" "She said she had a childhood friend who was like a sister, but they had drifted apart over something silly. She said if anything happened to her, she trusted that friend to take care of Matthew as if he were her own son. Margaret was moved to learn that Dorothy had spoken about her to others. It was further proof that her old friend had really planned everything very carefully, but not everything was rosy. 2 weeks after Sylvia's visit, Margaret began to notice she was being watched. Strange cars drove slowly past the house, and she felt like she was being followed when she went into town. One night, while helping Matthew with his homework, Margaret heard strange noises outside. She told Matthew to stay inside and went to investigate. Outside, she found signs that someone had been rummaging through the garden, upturned plants, as if someone was searching for something buried. "Margaret, is everything okay?" called Matthew from the door. "Yes, my dear. Just some animals messing with the garden," lied Margaret, not wanting to worry the boy. But the next morning she found a letter under the door. There was no sender, just a typed message. "We know Dorothy hid something else. Matthew isn't safe until you hand over what is rightfully ours. We have lawyers and resources. You can't fight us forever." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Nathan and Martha Thompson hadn't given up. They still believed there was something valuable hidden and were willing to intimidate an elderly woman and a child to get it. Margaret decided she needed professional help. She contacted a lawyer specializing in family law and also installed a basic security system in the house. Attorney Paul Mitchell, the lawyer, analyzed the situation seriously. "Mrs. Margaret, this is a clear attempt at intimidation. We'll document everything and, if necessary, file for a restraining order against these people." "Can they take Matthew away from me?" asked Margaret, voicing her greatest fear. "Not based on the evidence we have," assured Attorney Paul. "The adoption was legal, Matthew is clearly well cared for, and the letter left by Dorothy is a powerful document. But we need to be prepared for any legal attempts they might make." Meanwhile, Margaret decided to talk to Matthew about the situation, adapting the truth so as not to scare him unnecessarily. "Matthew, remember the relatives who wanted to find you?" began Margaret. "The ones Grandma said weren't good people?" asked Matthew. "That's right. They still think they're entitled to something that belonged to your grandmother. They might try to bother us again." Matthew became thoughtful. "Margaret, can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" "Of course, my dear. You can tell me anything. When Grandma was getting very tired, she gave me one more thing to hide. She said it was just in case very bad people tried to hurt me. She called it the last protection." Margaret felt her heart race. "What was it, Matthew?" "It's a recording," Matthew revealed. "Grandma recorded some men talking about how they were going to take the house and put me in an orphanage afterward. She said she kept it as proof that they didn't really want me." "Where is this recording?" "Buried in the same place where the tin with the key was," said Matthew. "Grandma taught me to hide important things in places only I knew." Margaret realized that Dorothy had been even smarter than she had imagined. She had not only planned to leave Matthew with someone trustworthy, but had also gathered evidence to protect him legally. "Matthew, I think the time has come to get that recording," said Margaret. "It might be exactly what we need to protect ourselves for good." That night, after making sure no one was watching them, Margaret and Matthew went to the garden to retrieve the second box that Dorothy had buried. Inside it, they found a small digital recorder and a stack of photographs. The photos showed Nathan and Martha Thompson in meetings with a man Margaret didn't recognize. On the back of one of the photos, Dorothy had written, "Corrupt lawyer hired to forge documents, Joseph Carter." The recording was even more revealing. On it, Nathan could be clearly heard talking about his plans. "As soon as we get custody of the kid, we sell the property and split the money. We'll put the child in a public orphanage, no one will question it. We'll say we can't afford to take care of him." "And if someone investigates?" asked Martha's voice. "Who's going to investigate? An orphaned child with no family. Carter has already arranged the fake documents proving our close relationship. Dorothy was stubborn, but now that she's out of the picture, there's no one to get in our way." Margaret was horrified. The recording proved that Nathan and Martha not only wanted the property, but were willing to abandon Matthew as soon as they got what they wanted. "Margaret," called Matthew, seeing the shocked expression on her face. "Matthew, your grandmother was a very wise woman," said Margaret, hugging the boy. She managed to record the proof that these people are exactly what she always said they were. The next morning, Margaret took the recording and the photos directly to Attorney Paul. The lawyer was thrilled with the evidence. "Mrs. Wilson, this changes everything," he said, listening to the recording for the second time. "With this evidence, we can not only defend ourselves, but also sue these people for attempted fraud and conspiracy." "And will Matthew be safe?" asked Margaret. "Completely safe," assured Attorney Paul. "In fact, I'm going to suggest we file a preemptive lawsuit. We'll make public what these people tried to do, to protect other families who might be in similar situations." 2 weeks later, the story of Margaret and Matthew was in the local newspapers. Not for sensationalism, but as a warning about people who take advantage of orphaned children for financial gain. Nathan and Martha Thompson were arrested for attempted fraud and conspiracy. The lawyer Joseph Carter lost his license to practice, and Margaret received dozens of letters of support from people in the area, many sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity. But the most special moment came when Matthew, now 12 years old and well-adjusted to city life, received a full scholarship to a private school. The scholarship was offered by a foundation that had read about his story in the newspaper. "Margaret, will you let me accept the scholarship?" asked Matthew, a bit unsure. "Of course, my dear," replied Margaret, moved. "Your grandmother always wanted you to have the best education possible. She would be very proud." "But what if I get too busy with my studies and you're left alone?" worried Matthew. Margaret smiled, touched by the boy's concern. "Matthew, part of loving someone is wanting that person to grow and achieve their dreams. I'll be so proud watching you develop." That night, as Matthew slept, Margaret sat on the porch of the house that was now truly hers and his. She looked at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Dorothy. You gave me the greatest gift I could ever receive." A year later, Margaret and Matthew's life had completely stabilized. Matthew excelled at his new school, both academically and socially. He had become popular among his classmates for his intelligence and kindness, traits that Margaret attributed to the careful upbringing Dorothy had given him. Margaret, in turn, had found a new purpose. She started working as a volunteer at a support center for families in vulnerable situations, using her experience to help others going through similar difficulties. "Margaret, Mrs. Catherine wants to speak with you," said Matthew one afternoon, arriving from school. Mrs. Catherine was the principal of Matthew's school, a respected woman in the community. Margaret worried for a moment, thinking Matthew might be having some trouble. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Catherine," greeted Margaret when she arrived at the school. "Margaret, I need to speak with you about Matthew," said the principal, but her tone was friendly. "Actually, I want to give you some wonderful news." Margaret relaxed. "What news?" "Matthew has been selected to represent our school in a state math competition," announced Mrs. Catherine proudly. "He's one of the brightest students we've ever had here." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears of pride. "Really?" "Absolutely. And there's more. The competition is in New York, and if he does well, he could get a full scholarship to a federal university when he reaches high school." When Margaret told Matthew the news, the boy was thrilled, but his first concern was typical of him. "Will you be able to travel with me to New York?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world," assured Margaret. "We'll go together, and I'll be in the front row cheering for you." The trip to New York was the first time Margaret and Matthew had left their home region together. They took the opportunity to visit museums, parks, and even visited Dorothy's grave, which Margaret had located through public records. "Grandma, I made it here," said Matthew, placing flowers on the simple grave. "And Margaret took care of me just like you said she would." Margaret was moved to see Matthew's maturity and his gratitude for the grandmother who had protected him until the end. In the math competition, Matthew placed third among over 100 participants. It wasn't first place, but for a child who had spent months alone and traumatized, it was an extraordinary achievement. "I'm so proud of you," said Margaret, hugging Matthew after the results. "Even though I didn't win?" asked Matthew. "Matthew, you've already won everything that matters," replied Margaret. "You've overcome trauma, become a polite and intelligent boy, and taught me that family isn't about blood, but about love. On the way back home, Matthew asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Margaret, do you want me to call you Mom?" Margaret was surprised. They had never specifically discussed the terms they would use for each other. Margaret had always let Matthew feel comfortable choosing how to address her. "Only if you want to," Margaret replied carefully. "The most important thing to me is that you feel comfortable." "I want to," said Matthew decisively. "Grandma was my grandmother and I'll always love her, but you're my mom now. It's you who takes care of me, teaches me, and loves me every day." Margaret pulled the car over to the side of the road and hugged Matthew, both of them crying with emotion. It was the moment they officially became mother and son, not just on paper, but in their hearts. Back at the house, they found a surprise waiting for them. The neighborhood had organized to prepare a welcome party celebrating Matthew's participation in the competition. Mr. Walter, the notary, was there with his wife. Mrs. Irene had brought a homemade cake. Even Sylvia, the social worker, had shown up to congratulate Matthew. "This boy is a pride for our community," Mr. Walter said to Margaret, "and you, my dear, have proven that love has no age." The party lasted until late afternoon. Matthew played with other children from the neighborhood, many of whom had become his close friends. Margaret chatted with the adults, who had adopted her as part of the community. When everyone had left and the house returned to its familiar silence, Margaret and Matthew sat on the porch to talk about the day. "Mum," said Matthew, testing the new word, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, my son," replied Margaret, smiling as she heard the new terms. "Are you happy?" asked Matthew. "I mean, even having to take care of me, are you happy?" Margaret was surprised by the depth of the question. "Matthew, you completely transformed my life. Before I found you, I was lost, alone, not knowing what to do with the rest of my life. You gave me a purpose, taught me to love again, and showed me that family can come in the most unexpected ways. So you don't regret it?" "Never," said Margaret firmly. "In fact, I think Dorothy knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't just save you. She saved both of us." 2 years passed, and Margaret and Matthew's life had become stable and happy. Matthew, now 14, continued to excel in school and had developed an interest in engineering, inspired by math and science projects. Margaret, at 70 years old, maintained a surprising energy. Besides her volunteer work, she had started writing a blog about late adoption, sharing her experience to inspire other older people who were considering adopting children. "Mom, a letter arrived for you," said Matthew one morning, handing over an official envelope. Margaret immediately recognized the letterhead. It was from the Department of Education. When she opened the letter, she discovered that Matthew had been selected for a special program for young talents, which would guarantee him specialized academic guidance and virtually secure a spot at any federal university in the country. "Matthew!" shouted Margaret, excited. "You did it!" "Did what?" asked Matthew, running into the room. Margaret showed him the letter, and Matthew read it quickly, his eyes widening with each line. "Does this mean I'll get to study engineering?" asked Matthew, still processing the information. "It means you can study anything you want," replied Margaret, hugging her son. "Dorothy would be so proud of you." That afternoon, they visited Dorothy's grave to share the good news. It was a ritual they had developed. Whenever something important happened, they would go tell Matthew's grandmother. "Grandma, your plan worked," said Matthew, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "I am safe, well taken care of, and now I'll be able to study to become an engineer." "And Margaret, Mom is happy too." Margaret watched silently, still amazed by Matthew's maturity and gratitude. Even at 14, he never forgot to acknowledge the sacrifice Dorothy had made for him. "Dorothy," whispered Margaret, "your boy is becoming a wonderful man. You can rest in peace." A gentle breeze rustled the flowers on the grave, and Margaret felt that her old friend was truly at peace, knowing her plan had worked perfectly. On their way home, Margaret and Matthew made plans for the future. The Young Talent program would start next year, and Matthew would have to spend a few weeks in Washington, D.C. for training and orientation. "Will you miss me?" asked Matthew, slightly worried. "Of course I will," admitted Margaret, "but I'll also be very proud knowing you're following your dreams. And don't forget, you'll always have a home to come back to." "What about you?" asked Matthew. "What will you do while I'm studying?" Margaret smiled. "I was thinking of writing a book about our story, about how a widow and an orphaned boy found each other and formed a family. I think it could inspire others." "Can I help?" offered Matthew. "After all, it's my story too." "That would be perfect," agreed Margaret. "So let's write it together." And so Margaret and Matthew began working on their book, documenting not only their own journey, but also honoring the memory of Dorothy and her extraordinary wisdom. The book, titled Dorothy's Last Gift, was published 2 years later and became a bestseller in the inspirational biography category. More importantly, it sparked a movement raising awareness about late adoption and unconventional families. Margaret and Matthew began receiving letters from across the country, with people sharing their own stories of overcoming challenges and family. Many older people reached out asking about the adoption process, inspired by their story. "Mum, look how many people our story has helped," said Matthew, now 16 and about to enter university. "Grandma never imagined her plan would inspire so many." "I think she did know," replied Margaret, looking at the pile of letters on the table. "Dorothy was always a visionary. She planned our family, but perhaps she also planned for our story to inspire others." End of story. Our journey has come to an end, but the message lives on in our hearts. The story of Margaret and Matthew teaches us that family is much more than blood. It's love, care, and choice. How about sharing your thoughts on this beautiful story? Do you believe love can overcome any obstacle? Leave your honest comment and tell us where you're following us from. If this story touched your heart, like it touched ours, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this one.